So last week we talked about the story of two men. We talked about Abraham and Gideon. Now, Abraham was this man of great faith, of unshakable faith, and God told him something, and it didn't matter what his situation said. He held on to that promise, and he focused on that promise until it became reality. And then we have the story of Gideon. And Gideon was not a man of as much courage. He was a man that needed a lot more convincing. He didn't have a very high view of himself, so the angel had to speak, had to prophesy into his identity, had to address the identity piece and encourage him into the way that God saw him. And eventually he lived into that, but it wasn't immediate. And so what happened in the story is that this angel comes and says, "Mighty man of valor," but that's not the way Gideon sees himself. And then he gives Gideon this destiny that he's going to live into, and he's like, I'm going to test God on this, because he was afraid. I mean, he has this fear of failure, and we all to some extent have a fear of failure. And so he tested the Lord with, and maybe you've heard of fleecing before, and what the story of this is he put out a fleece and he said, if I come back in the morning and the fleece is wet, but the ground is dry, and then he also did the other way, if the ground is wet and the fleece is dry, then I'll know that you've sent, that God's actually calling me to this, because that's not possible. So I'm going to send out a fleece, and we'll see if God's in this. So he had this fear of failure, and God was trying to convince him that it was going to be all right. Now, this is where the story kind of gets neat. They didn't have a very big army, so he's afraid of losing the battle, so he's talking to God about this, and God's like, maybe your army's too big. So they actually dwindled down the size of the army and made it even less people. Not a very logical, by our standard, way of doing things. But what's neat is he was causing Gideon to see this in a different way. He was causing him to change his perspective and to change his approach. Okay? And so they surround the enemy camp at night, and then they make a whole lot of ruckus and break some things, and then the enemies are just so discombobulated, they actually attack each other. Now, what's really neat about this, and the point that Paul was drawing out, was that we typically have one way of looking at things. I have to overcome it, I have to be strong, I have to do this. But Gideon didn't have strength on his side, they had cunning. So he saw his problem in a totally different way. And I mean, this present pandemic that we're in has made so many of us have to do this, right? I mean, church has moved so much more online, and we've developed all these skills that we didn't have. And business and all of these things, we're having to create different models to make things work. Because maybe what's worked in the past isn't going to work for the future, or it's certainly not going to work in the present. But it's reframing the failure that we've had, or the failure that we might feel. And it's causing us to look at it in a different way. It's causing us to be creative in these wonderful ways. It's really great. Thomas Edison, famous for being an inventor, has also famously said, I haven't failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. Now, imagine trying something 10,000 different ways, looking at it 10,000 different ways. Sometimes that's what it takes. Hopefully it's more like 10. But reframing what we see as failure as learning opportunities, or ways maybe to hold it in a different way, and to look at it in a different way. And how can I address this differently? Maybe it's not by strength, maybe it's by our cunning. Maybe we just have to take a different look at it.